This is Interpreting Wine host and founder Lawrence Francis, welcoming you to this, my Willamette Valley winemaker special. Across these 20 episodes recorded in quickfire fashion in January 2020, I got to meet a broad selection of people making wine in the region, both a variety of winemaking scale from the micro to the macro, and also different focuses that include different aging vessels, different grape varieties, sparkling wines, and of course different interpretations of Pinot. Episodes are going to be released in the order that they were recorded, so you'll get to be a virtual guest on the tour. 2 things you can do to help spread this series even further. One is to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, either where you're listening or on your favorite podcast platform. And the second, the one that's really going to help push this out there, is to head to interpretingwine.com/iTunes and leave a review letting me know what you think. A genuine, huge thank you in advance. Today's episode of the Willamette Valley Winemaker Special features Brianne Day of Day Wines. A hugely passionate, knowledgeable and articulate communicator, Brianne tells us her origin story growing up in the Pacific Northwest and talks to her very unique wine education. She touches on the structure she's created around Day Wines, which is Day Camp. She talks to the origin of the fruit that she's using in her wines, drawn as it is from both the Willamette Valley in the north of the state and the Applegate Valley in the south. Before we taste 4 of her wines that really demonstrate this diversity in the glass, a Chardonnay, a Rosé, a Pinot Noir and a Tannat, before she looks ahead to 2020. Enjoy!
My folks moved to this area when I was still living at home with them. I was about 16, and I had my first automobile and no friends, and I would either drive into Portland and try to explore, or I would drive out this way, and was immediately fairly mesmerized by the fact that there was viticulture here. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest and, like in the suburbs, and it seemed very glamorous to see wine production. It felt like I was really into reading kind of classic American authors at the time, so I was reading a lot of Steinbeck and Hemingway and Fitzgerald and stuff, and they were always traipsing about places in Europe drinking wine, and it felt like that was much more close by to actually see the wine growing, but it wasn't a part of my upbringing. It wasn't a part of my family. And the first time I traveled internationally, I was 19 and was traveling in Italy, and I went over there to kind of on a religious mission to preach to English-speaking people. I was raised very religiously, and got to Italy and immediately was thrown off from the mission and found a new gospel. So I tasted good wine for the first time in a little cave in a town on Lake Como, and everything we were tasting was Northern Italian wines. And what really stood out to me was that the wines themselves were such an expression of the people of that place. The man who owned the shop was telling me they only grow this variety in this town and it's nowhere else in the world. And I've since come to learn that there are a lot of Italian varieties that have a lot of different names and they're called different things. Well, they happen to have the same genetic material, but in any case, I was really astounded by that to idea that, this thing came from this place and these people saw this as a cultural expression. And I came home from that trip really thinking about those things and still not thinking that I had any place in it locally, because I thought it was all familial. I thought if your family did it, you could do it, and mine didn't. But it stuck with me, and so much so that in my early 20s, I was putting my ex-husband through college and saving to travel because I had this really giant travel bug, and read the read the word enology about 6 months before we were to leave for the trip and didn't know what it meant, so looked it up and found that it was the science of winemaking. And I thought, well, if there's a science of winemaking, then it can be learned. It can be, you could probably go to school for it. And I found that that was the case, and that there were schools locally here in Oregon that taught winemaking. And so I kind of filed that away in my head and proposed to my ex-husband to, why don't we go to wine producing regions on this trip that we've been planning. And so we sold everything we owned and had managed to save enough money that we took off and traveled for about 20 months continuously and went to wine producing regions all over the planet, starting in New Zealand and Australia, and then went through Southeast Asia because we wanted to go there. Went through almost all of Western Europe and a tiny bit of Eastern Europe, and then went down to South America. And at the end of the trip, after speaking with like many winemakers and many wine growers and sommeliers and tasting, we had a blog that we kept track of how many wines we were tasting, and the blog was called 1,000 Wines, and ended up tasting about 1,500. We kind of blew our goal out of the water, but came home feeling that the winemaking aspect of the industry was what appealed to me the most. And so I was a newly single person at the end of that trip, and which is good. I'm still friends with my ex-husband. It was needed to happen, but off on this new career path. And so I started classes immediately for winemaking, and was so eager to learn and so unaccustomed to sitting still after 2 years of traveling that I left and did my first harvest in New Zealand, and was down there for about 3 months and learned a ton, and came home back to Oregon and was working for a winery here and back in classes, and started doing 2 internships a year in the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. And then in the in-between times, always with the goal in mind of having my own winery at some point, I would work in other aspects of the industry. So I worked for a retail wine shop for about 1 day a week for 5 years. I began working in restaurants for the first time because I wanted to know what kinds of things drove people's purchase decisions when they were in restaurant settings. I wanted to cater my label to be to that kind of clientele. I sold barrels for a French cooperage for about a year, and then I worked in other people's wine cellars as well, and really tried to come at the industry from a variety of viewpoints, knowing that I wanted to have my own label eventually. So I ended up working, I don't know how many harvests before I started my own brand. I think I want to say about 8. And then in 2012, I purchased my first fruit and made 5 barrels of one Pinot Noir, and was able to get distribution in 2 pretty key American markets based on that wine, in New York and in Chicago. And I was working 4 jobs at the time to pay for my next year's vintage, because it's obviously very expensive to purchase grapes and barrels and all of those things. And so I had 2 full-time restaurant jobs. I had a part-time cellar job during the day, and I was working 1 day a week in a retail wine shop. And at one of the restaurant jobs, I waited on a group of people, and they happened to spot my tattoo, which is kind of sizable here, a bunch of grapevines on my arm. And the gentleman said something like, and this was totally fine. I know it's not exactly the most Me Too friendly statement, but he's a nice older guy from a different generation, and I took it and as no offense, but he said, "What's a pretty girl like you have a big tattoo like that on her arm for?" And I explained to him what I'd been up to, all the traveling and all the internships, and how I had wine and barrel. And his questions became more and more business focused throughout the course of his dinner. And by the end of his dinner, he said, "I'm going to back you." Yeah. And I thought to myself, I don't think this man knows what that means. And, the costs involved and that it's not necessarily a great return on investment to somebody and those kinds of things. But I set up a meeting with him for later in the week, and I had already developed a business plan and a 10-year projected budget. And so I presented that to him. And in the days between meeting him and this meeting where I presented these things, I thought about how big do I want to go on this, and do I ask for enough funds to get through the next vintage, or do I give him a really big version of it and see if he accepts that? And I decided just to swing for the fences, and I thought if he was scared off by that, he probably wasn't the right person to be partnering with, and he wasn't scared off by it. He was like, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, cool, let's do this. So that's what happened, and we were able to grow the brand much faster with that help. I think eventually I probably would have gotten to where I am now, but I would not be where I am now if I hadn't had that help. So now we make around 6,000 cases and 17 different wines at current count. And we have 5 other small producers that make wine in my building also. We purchased a building in 2015. This building was formerly a vitamin production facility, and we very, very quickly turned that into a winery and built out a tasting room, and that's where we are now.
I absolutely love being here to hear these stories because, I lay the groundwork. I open the door for you to, and for all the guests really to tell their story in whatever way that they want to. And I've got to say, personally, that's one of the most inspiring stories that I've heard because, you could on one hand, and maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's already been said to you, oh, you were lucky, you were in the right place at the right time, but actually, look back at all of that work. I mean, I think it's amazing, really, to go from I can learn enology, i.e., somebody kind of teaching you it, sitting in a classroom, through to all of these things that you've done, the harvests, the restaurant jobs, the wine shop, which to me, 100% speaks to you learning it for yourself. You didn't sit back and wait for the universe or somebody sitting in or standing in front of a chalkboard to teach you. You went out there and grabbed that passion kind of by the throat or by the cuffs or wherever you grabbed it and made it happen. And it's just such an amazing, I think, example, and I think it will be an inspiration for a lot of people that when you really, really, really go for what you want to happen, then that luck, or however people like to sort of characterize it, but those sorts of things kind of come together. The tattoo, the person who eventually backed you, and it's quite incredible. One part of the story that I was aware of coming in and kind of did really show up in really all the research that I did, and I guess some of the sort of videos and social media that I saw was really the idea of day wines, being, as you say, your label and the production that you've just spoken to, and we'll try some of those later on, hopefully. But also, speaking to the idea of day camp and the idea of this being a site that it's not just about you. it's about other people and other people's education and other people's wines as well. So I wonder if you just sort of kind of paint that picture for us as well.
For sure. There are things that are prohibitive for people who are doing what I'm doing and starting a small label. One of those things is not having a home to make it. And so I wanted to have a space that I could share with other people for a few different reasons. It's not entirely altruistic. I don't require this much space yet for as much wine as I'm producing, and perhaps someday I will make enough wine to fill up this space. But in the meantime, I have a loan payment to pay back to my backer, and having other producers in the building helps me to make that happen. So it's not like I'm giving anybody space for free, but it does help to have some shared resources. There's no reason for small producers that are making 500 or 1,000 cases to own a press that costs $40,000, or a sorting line that costs $25,000. Like those kind of upfront expenditures can be very prohibitive, and so sharing the space and sharing the equipment is how we in the local industry have really gotten around it. And I'm not the only person that is doing this. You're going to be speaking with Kate Norris, you said later on, and Kate and her partner have a facility in the city in Portland, and they're doing that there with their Southeast Wine Collective, and more people have actually picked up on it in this area, because small producers are a growing component of the industry here in Oregon in a pretty exponential rate compared to what people classically think of as wineries in a region. There aren't nearly as many large cash holders that come to Oregon and buy up property as there are small producers that want in on sharing a part of their dream and making something happen there. So some of that was a part of what I was thinking about. But having a shared space really promotes this collaborative spirit. There's a lot of experiment that happens among small producers that I think happen more often among small producers than larger producers, because we're not set in our ways, and we in a way have less to lose. I mean, if you're experimenting on 1.5 tons of fruit and it goes bad, that you're out the cost of the fruit and maybe the cost of processing it. But so it's not crippling necessarily, although it's all a matter of scale. I mean, $10,000 out the door to a small producer could be as crippling as $100,000 out the door to a large producer. So, but the idea of a collaborative spirit and of an area that can foster some experimentation and trying new things is very appealing to me. And I appreciate that myself and a lot of the producers that have come through this building have that idea and that kind of mindset. And there's been some really cool, interesting things that have happened as a result.
Yeah, I mean, and being as we are sat here in the barrel room, and we're sat here at Day Wines. We're not next to the field, and we're not able to sort of see the fruit. And what I've been doing really on this journey is really asking all of the winemakers to kind of, where that is the case, just give me and then give the listener that kind of virtual tour. Take us around there, and if we were to sort of stand out there in the field, sort of Google Map style, what are the sorts of things that we would see, and then beyond that, again, in whatever way makes sense, potentially talk a bit to the geography, and more the geology, I guess, what's kind of happening under the soil, to the degree that you've looked and that you happy to share.
For sure. It's interesting when you don't own your own vineyard sites that eventually I would like to have my own vineyard site, but I don't think I'll ever grow all of my own fruit. I really like the freedom that I have, and the versatility and the ability to respond really quickly to the needs of the market or things that my distributors ask for in not owning my own vineyard sites. So I work at last count with 17 different vineyards in the Willamette Valley in the northern part of the state and in the Applegate Valley in the southern part of the state. So they're kind of the two extreme areas of Oregon. The Applegate Valley is as far south as you can go before you hit California. It's most of the vines are about, as the crow flies, about 15, 20 miles from the California border. And then the other fruit that I work with, the majority of the fruit that I work with is from the Willamette Valley, which is up here in the northern part of the state. And so there is a dramatically different, all kinds of situations between those 17 vineyard sites that I work with. At last count, it was, I want to say it was 22 grape varieties, something like that. And I know Oregon is known for Pinot Noir primarily, so people are pretty surprised when I might comment that we're working with that many grape varieties and making that many different blends that we are. And I really wanted to find those grape varieties and the less typical things about Oregon because through my travels, I came across so many different types of wines that were really beautiful, appropriate for different occasions and different meals and different uses. And the idea of Oregon, which has a landmass about the size of half of France, being dedicated to only one grape variety seemed ludicrous to me. Yeah. When you go over to France and the same, area of size is growing 30 different grape varieties or whatever, Yeah. So I really wanted to make wines that are very expressive of a place. And since I'm a Pacific Northwest native and been in Oregon for over 24 years at this point, I really wanted to make wines that showed off to people this place that I still am pretty in love with. And I felt like more varieties than just Pinot would show different aspects of Oregon. And so that's really what I was looking for. And so I source fruit from, and my most northern vineyards that I work with are in the Chehalis Mountain AVA, which is to the north of where we are now, not by far, just by about 15 miles to the northwest. And that area, much of Oregon, is either volcanic sedimentary or marine sedimentary. Those are kind of the two things that are, primarily make up Oregon. So the majority of the vineyard sites that I'm working with in Chehalis Mountain AVA are volcanic sedimentary. I have some really surprising sites up there. I work with one that was planted 25 years ago to Viognier and Pinot Gris, because this man, his name is Scott Schroeder. He is a gentleman farmer. He is a engineer, and he's like the kind of engineer that writes that makes computer software and things like software engineer, I guess is what he is. But he has really thrown himself into this plot of land that he also has, and it's like a little snapshot out of Tuscany or something. He's got fruit trees all around his house, and he always has the most elaborate flower gardens. And then he has these 25-year-old Viognier and Pinot Gris vines that have been farmed organically since they were put into the ground, which is important to me. I try to source all from organic or biodynamic vineyards. And two varieties that, Pinot Gris is fairly widely planted in Oregon, but Viognier isn't, and especially not that far north. And when he planted it 25 years ago, it was probably climate change has changed things to where that fruit gets ripe every year. But I imagine the first couple of years, he must have had some pretty lean Viognier on that site. And so now I make a wine from that site that I call Tears of Vulcan, because I co-ferment the Viognier and the Pinot Gris on their skins. I wanted to make an orange wine that was kind of reminiscent or along the lines of wines that I had in northeastern Italy and Slovenia that were textural and aromatic skin contact wines. And I thought Viognier would be an interesting grape to try that with. So I make that wine every year. I direct press some Muscat from a neighboring vineyard in the Chehalis Mountain AVA. And so it's Muscat, Viognier, and Pinot Gris. And it's called Tears of Vulcan because I was thinking, what do Oregon and these places in northeastern Italy or in Sicily where these wines come from, what do they have in common, if anything? And the only thing I could think about was the volcanic soils. And so I named it after the god of volcanoes and, wanted to kind of highlight that part of it. So that's a really interesting site that I'm thrilled to be working with, that maybe it was up for grabs when I was interested in it. Maybe it was not something that your average winery in Oregon would have any interest in, but for me it was like, oh, that's a cool place. Very, very interesting things going on there. I get quite a lot of fruit from a site just down the road from that vineyard that's owned by the winery Anna Me, and they grow more fruit than the winery's current needs, and so I get some really interesting grapes from them. I get Pinot Meunier, and I get Gewürztraminer, and Müller-Thurgau, and Pinot Blanc, and Riesling, all from them, and put those into a few different wines. I have several blends that I make that are not specifically site driven wines. They're kind of more stylistically driven, and I call those all Vendédays, like a play on a vin de paix, a little punny play on my name. So the white version is kind of like my take on an Alsatian blend, like I forget what they're called. I've got the Austrian version in my head, the Gemützersalz, but like a Edelsvicker, kind of like a play on an Edelsvicker. And so it's Pinot Blanc and Riesling and Müller-Thurgau and Muscat, real aromatic. This year I just made an orange version that's Gewürztraminer and Müller-Thurgau and Riesling all on its skins. And I make a red version that's Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Pinot Gris. All of my other wines are definitely site-driven, site-specific wines. If you come down south from the Chehalis Mountain AVA and go southwest of there, you'll end up over in Yamhill Carlton. And I make Chardonnay from a site called Pente, which Pente is a winery that if you haven't had a chance to try, I highly recommend it. I worked for this family in 2011 and really view them as mentors, and they are grower producers, so they typically make all of the wine that they grow into their wines, or all of the grapes that they grow into their wines. And so I'm really fortunate to be able to buy some Chardonnay from them and get 2 tons every year from them. And it's a southwest slope in the vineyard that faces the Coast Mountain Range, and you from the slope where the Chardonnay grows, you can look straight out, and if the mountains were in the way, you'd see the ocean. It's just this gorgeous view. It's all marine sediment soils, and really creates this minerally. I'll have to pour it for you, but this really mineral driven, very pretty Chardonnay from that site that I'm very pleased that I am able to work with. Now I'm thinking, geographically speaking, where do I go from here? If you continue to go south out of Yamhill Carlton, you'd end up over in the McMinnville AVA. And from the McMinnville AVA, I get Pinot Noir from a site called Momtazi. And it's a biodynamic site that's the largest biodynamic vineyard in Oregon. And it is a wild and crazy, amazing site. It's large, and so there's a lot of diversity of slopes and aspects and elevations where Pinot is planted, and there's a variety of vine age as well. They have been planting for a number of years, and I try to work with fruit from all over the site to try to have the most diversity of clonal material and all of those other things. So it's primarily volcanic soils as well, but there are pockets of marine sediment. It's because there's so much to choose from. And I like that. I like working when I work with a site like Momtazi, and also I get Pinot Noir from another site called Johan that has a lot of diversity, and I'm able to work with a lot of different clonal varieties of Pinot Noir. I try to get as diverse of an offering as possible because I feel like it makes a more interesting wine. And with all my blends, I co-ferment everything. So my white blend is all the grapes go in at the same at harvest. Everything's blended. I don't ferment things separately and then later taste and try to fine tune them, because I'm really trying to make the wines be about the site. And I feel like if I blend later on, I'm going to be fine tuning things to my palate, and I don't want that to be the case. I don't want it to be all about me. I want it to be about what was this year and what is this place. And so similarly with Pinot Noir, I do the same thing where I co-ferment all of the different clones and view it all as one wine right at harvest, and not as something that I'm going to take care of down the road. So yeah, from Momtazi, if you head east, you'll end up in the Van Duzer corridor, which is where Johan is. And that's a site that is interesting from a geological standpoint, because it has things that other places don't have in the Willamette Valley because of where it's located. And so it is directly on the Van Duzer corridor, which is this geological channel that is like, it's like a hole is cut out of the Coast Mountain Range, and the winds from the Pacific Ocean are sucked into the Willamette Valley in the evenings, primarily in the summer. And really that the Van Duzer corridor existing is what keeps the interior of the Willamette Valley cool enough for Pinot Noir to grow. And Johan sits directly on that channel, and it was created by the Missoula floods that happened 15,000 years ago, when a lake and a wall of ice kept melting and refreezing and melting and refreezing up at Lake Victoria and over in Montana, and all this geological debris would come into all of Oregon, and it cut its way out to the ocean from there, and basically left behind rubble that doesn't exist other places. So there's things like granite at Johan Vineyard, which is completely not heard of in the Willamette Valley. In addition to having this, subsurface ancient seabed and volcanic loam on top of it. So it's a really diverse geological site that produces some really fun Pinot Noir. Really consistently delicious wines come out of that site with varying temperatures and everything, and a lot, of course, is to be credited to the farmers that are doing a really great job year after year at growing the fruit. So that's primarily. There are many sites that I have forgotten about and haven't mentioned in the Willamette Valley. But then if you get in your car and you drive 6 hours, well, not that far, 4.5 hours south, you'll be down in the Applegate Valley. And the Applegate Valley is an entirely different place. It's higher elevation. It's between the area between Oregon and California, where it's going into kind of a high elevation mountain pass. So most of my grapes are grown at approximately 1,500 feet, and that's just ground level. They're growing more on flat surfaces in the Applegate Valley than they are in the Willamette Valley. And the shifts in temperature are really, really dramatic, even in the summer, where it might be 90 degrees during the day. It'll drop down to 40 degrees at night. Fahrenheit, of course. And it's a huge shift that helps maintain the freshness of the fruit and the integrity of the fruit, and creates these really interesting wines that are being grown out of varieties like Syrah and Tannat and Cabernet Franc and Vermentino, and I get Marsanne, Roussanne, Grenache Blanc. I get Malvasia Bianca. I've got Zabibo that just went in the ground down there. I've got Nero d'Avola that's going in the ground this year. I mean, just interesting stuff down there. And a lot of these growers are, some of them are new, some of them are newer plantings that I'm working with, and a lot of the experimental things that we're trying to do are with new growers that are willing to plant them for us. But some of these sites, it's like, what were you thinking, mister? Like when you planted this in 1972 and nothing was out here. The one site that I work with is a vineyard called Lane Vineyard, was planted in 1972, and it's in the middle of nowhere in the Applegate Valley. You have to go down a long dirt road and you wind up in this beautiful little valley where I'm always looking around for black bear every time I'm there. I'm just like, I know I'm going to see a bear. I know I've seen bear poop so much in the vineyard. I'm just like obsessed with looking for bears. He originally planted the majority of that vineyard to Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. And in 2009, it was being leased by a local winery, and the winemaker there was a man named Herb Quaddy, and Herb asked them to graft over sections of the vineyard to other varieties like Tannat. So I now have Tannat that I buy from that site that's on roots from 1972, and then, you know, the grafts are now about 11 years old, and it's a really interesting variety to work with. I'm really stoked that I have that opportunity. Or wait, in England you would say chuffed, right?
Chuffed,
yeah. I just heard this word recently and I love it, so I want to try to use it more.
Thank you so much for doing that and taking us on that tour around, and, you know, more places than I'm going to get to visit, and probably more places than most people, even that live here, ever kind of get to visit. And I think, you know, that's what I'm seeing, as I'm kind of asking the same question really to a lot of people. You know, no one's answers are the same as anyone else's, but obviously there in your answer, you've really, I think, you know, demonstrated what you're doing here in terms of, and through your knowledge of the different growing sites. And it's obviously, you know, a deep and kind of passionate knowledge that you have to, you know, go out and stand in the bear poop and you know, find the spots and really, yeah, just kind of approach it with the passion. And I think, yeah, it just sort of really, speaks through to, the self-education, the going out there, the working the harvest, going to all the hemispheres, and then, you know, almost, to me, sort of, you know, bringing that sort of global sense really that you've developed in your own sort of self-education, bringing that global sense and applying that to Oregon and bringing like the kind of the best of Oregon really, and the representation of Oregon. So I'm really excited to see the 4 wines that you've chosen that I think will sort of follow through and show how all of that knowledge and all of that experience shows up in the glass.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, thank you. I'm excited to show these to you. So the first one that I poured is Chardonnay from Belle Vineyard that I spoke about over in Yamhill, Carlton, AVA. This is the 2016 vintage, which is our current release, and partially why that is our current release is because I leave the Chardonnay in barrel for 22 months and then in bottle for a year before releasing it. I do that with my Chardonnay, and I do it with the Pinot Noirs, and some of the other reds actually stay in barrel even longer than that. I think being patient with barrel time is one way to make really elegant wines, and that's what I'm going for. So this is from that southwest slope that I was talking about, and we pick on the earlier side. I worked one harvest in Volnay and Burgundy, and actually it was the same year that I worked at Belle. I worked 2 harvests back to back in 2011 because Burgundy was really early that year and Oregon was really late. So I was able to go over to France and work for, I don't know, I was over there 6 weeks, I think, and then I came home and had 2 weeks off and then started Oregon harvest. It was a really crazy year. But what I noticed in Volnay is that the growers and the producers never measure sugar, and that's something Americans are obsessive about. New World wine wine producers, not just Americans, it's all about the bricks and measuring sugar. And over there, there was one central lab that all of the producers shared. And because in France, most people don't own the entire vineyard. They own like 6 rows in a vineyard. And so if they're taking samples, sharing that information with the other producers is one way to minimize how much labor each individual producer actually has to do. And so they take pH readings and then post them in this little lab, and everybody can keep track of, okay, the pH was this on that day and whatever. And that was something that I really apply when I'm choosing my pick dates. And so I tend to always pick this a little bit earlier because I want the acid to be intact and the main driver of the wine. And I like Chardonnay that's more on the mineral side and maybe a little bit less on the opulent side. And so that's what I'm trying for. I like to use large format barrels for certain wines, and the Chardonnay I do in one new 500 liter barrel, and then the rest of the wood is neutral. So, and I have enough of the 500 liter barrels now that I do Chardonnay entirely in the large format barrels. So the second wine is made of Syrah and Viognier, and it's a rosé. It's a direct press rosé. So I tried to have as limited skin contact as possible on this. This is typically a wine that I make as a red wine, and the reason I made it as rosé in this vintage, which is 2018, was because for a few years in a row, there were sizable forest fires in Northern California and Southern Oregon, and forest fires affect grapes. They create smoke taint in the wines, and I made a couple of wines from 2017 that had some smoke taint, and it's not pleasant. It's awful. And one of my wines from 2017 I didn't bottle yet because I don't want to try to sell a smoke taint wine. It's hard to approach buyers and continuously being like, oh yeah, that kind of weird campfire thing that's happening in this wine. Well, that's because I don't want to talk about that. I don't want that to be the thing. So that particular wine, it's a Cab Franc blend. I'm actually turning into a Maro. So I have distilled a couple of barrels, and I'm in the process of researching botanicals and stuff. And I thought a little bit of smokiness in an Amaro would be cool. So I'm actually, trying to make some lemonade out of that lemon. But this wine, because there were a lot of smoke or a lot of fires in the area again, I didn't want to risk it, and so I made all of my red fruit from Southern Oregon as rosé last year. And so this is 75% Syrah and 25% Viognier, no skin contact, total direct press, and then it was fermented in neutral wood for 8 months before being bottled. It's called Hock and Deuce, and that's also the name of the red version that I make of this wine. And the couple that I was telling you about that became my backers, that's their nicknames. That's Hock is an old college nickname of his, and his wife Diana, Richard's wife Diana, was 22 when they met, and so he always called her Double Deuce, and then shortened that to just Deuce, although she claims the reason why she's Deuce is because she's his second wife. But that's her own little joke. Wow. So this wine was all of my wines are native fermented. Neither of these were filtered. You see it a little bit more in this wine. There's a little bit of lees down in the bottom of the bottle, but obviously it settles and you don't have that in your glass. So. This is actually from the man that I mentioned, Herb Quaddy, who did the grafting of the Pinot. Gotcha. This is his home site. So he has a vineyard called Maze Vineyard. That's his home site, and that's where I get my Syrah from, and I get Malvasia Bianca and Cab Franc and Malbec and a lot of different things from him. So this is a site about 3 miles away from the Bear Poop Vineyard one that I was talking about. But the Applegate Valley, I didn't go into that much detail about it, other than that it's higher elevation, but it is so pretty down there. It's heavily forested with evergreens. A lot of rolling hills and peaks here and there. You can see some snow-capped peaks in the distance that are mostly in California. A lot of small family farms. There's nothing really a big-scale industry in the area. It's all small farms, winding back roads through valleys, little rivers that go into larger rivers. But it's very rural, and it's really, really beautiful down there. So this is grown at a great hillside that was planted 13 years ago, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So the reason why I keep emphasizing that I don't have any skin contact on this rosé is because smoke taint seems to exist in the skins of the grapes. So if I were to make this as a red, the more time that the wine has in contact with the skins when there is smoke taint present, the more of those smokiness gets into the actual wine. And so I was really adamant about just pressing it off as quickly as possible and getting the skins out of there. And I think it worked because I'm not picking up smoke taint in this wine. So that was kind of what I was going for.
Yeah. And I'll just throw that in there as well. I'm not either. I think what I would say here, though, it reminds me of a friend, another winemaker friend, who that said in their pursuit to make their rosé, they were trying to make a more serious rosé, and just that kind of comes to mind here because this I learned a new word last night, which is wines being thought of as porch pounders.
Yes.
Yeah, and this ain't that. There's so much. Wondering where I was going with that, but this I think I would say is I love the structure. I love the sort of the roundness. I love that that there is some tannin there. I'm not necessarily a fan of those like super simple rosés. So this is I think definitely one to seek out if you've got access to these wines, because this is I think even as well, this is the sort of rosé that I don't think it has to just be a summer rosé, because I think this could work at the dinner table really well as well. I think there's lots of potential for food pairings here as well. So this is lovely.
So this next wine is from Momtazi Vineyard that I was talking about in the McMinnville AVA. This is a site that I was familiar with prior to purchasing fruit because I have worked for other people that have purchased fruit from this site. When I was a barrel rep selling barrels, I sold barrels to these folks and tasted a lot of their wines in different cooperages and got to know the site pretty well that way. And I lived not far from this site for about a year. I lived about a mile down the road, and so really feel a kinship to that area. It's an area where it's not a surprise to wake up in the morning and have a herd of elk in your front yard, and that happened a lot of times when I lived out on the farm not far from there, where there'd be 60 or 70 head of elk just hanging out in the pasture, and it's pretty incredible. There's owls that are nightly flying over and checking in on everybody, and I haven't seen them, but I would be very curious to see them, and I've seen pictures taken at Momtazi Vineyard of cougar that are roaming about, and it's pretty it's a wild place. It's phenomenal. I really appreciate the family, and Momtazi is the proprietor, and his wife Flora, and they are Persian and got out of Iran when Flora was pregnant with their oldest daughter, who now is the winemaker there, in the early 80s when Iran was going through its civil war, and landed in Oregon. But Mo's family were farmers back in Iran, and he is a large proponent. He's a big proponent of biodynamics, obviously, but he also brings in some really interesting practices that are taken from his family back in Iran that are unusual for American standards, but the fruit is undeniably characterful and a little bit savage from this place, and I like that about it. I treat this wine extremely gently because I know that it can be a beast. I know that it can get really tannic, it can get really big, and so I'm extra gentle with it. I try to keep the fermenters a little bit cooler than the rest of my fermenters. I only do very delicate pigeage on them for my cap management, and this is how it expresses itself. And I'm really pleased with this wine. I really like how this wine came out.
I love it. And I've got to come in and say there, I think actually, you talking to that wine, is sort of, I think, given me and I hope the listener like a real high point in this series. I think firstly because it's not at all common for somebody who's to kind of talk so passionately really about somebody who's making wine in the same region and go into such depth and just feel the passion coming through, and I think it kind of almost goes both ways because I met them last night and I went to the site last night. And that may be in its own way. You've probably spoken more passionately and said more and shared more than they did. And so there's modesty, I think, here. And I think zooming out from that, it just shows that in this region, I'm kind of reminding back to the whole thing of rising tide lifts all ships. You talking up another producer doesn't take away from yourself. It only kind of enriches yourself, and I think it's obvious when you put a mic in your hand, and the sorts of things that you choose to share are really kind of illustrating that through deeds rather than saying any other sort of platitudes about how it is here. You're kind of walking the talk. So it's amazing. Yeah.
I wanted to pour this for you because it's such an anomaly for Oregon. It's Pinot from the Applegate Valley, from that vineyard I was talking about that's tucked away up in the hills, planted 1972 vines that were grafted to Pinot in 2009. And Pinot is a grape that's not common in the world at large. It originates in southwestern France, and I became more familiar with it up in the Pyrenees in the Roulegie region, although I know that it's... is it Cahors that is Pinot, or is it Maturon?
Cahors is Malbec.
It's Maturon.
Maturon, okay.
Right. In the New World, Uruguay has kind of adopted it as their version of what Malbec is to Argentina. Yeah. And in France and in Uruguay, and especially the New World versions, tend to be really aggressive wines. Really, they can be kind of hard as nails. I went to the Pyrenees to talk about Pinot with some folks after I had been working with it a little bit, and they do a lot of things to try to mitigate the tannic structure of the wines. In fact, microoxygenation came into existence because of Pinot. That was in France. That's where they first started using it. And in the Pyrenees, up in Roulegie, a lot of folks are using stainless steel tanks and then trying to do kind of like a carbonic maceration with it, where they keep the cap submerged because they're trying not to do punch downs, because they're trying to not have as much tannin come out. Yeah. It does not behave that way in Oregon at all. So that was really interesting to me. Oregon and Roulegie, the Applegate Valley and Roulegie actually have a lot of things in common in terms of like elevation. They're both about 1,500 feet elevation. They're both about a 45-minute to an hour drive from their respective oceans. Like if you're at the Atlantic, it took me, I was in Biarritz, I think that's where I was, and I drove up into Roulegie, and it was like an hour drive. And, that's how it is from the Pacific into the Applegate Valley. But it sure behaves differently in Oregon. It's much more, the acid is so present in this fruit. This year when I brought the Pinot in, my TA, my total acidity was 11 grams per liter. That's an extremely high TA. So I make the Pinot as a portion of my Rosé, and then I make it as a red like this. And tannin is not something I'm concerned about with it. I mean, I learned how to make red wine by making Pinot Noir, so I kind of treat all of my wines like Pinot Noir. I don't really do anything different for the bigger varieties, and maybe that has something to do with the fact that it's not hard as nails, but it's an interesting wine. I've been leaving the Pinot in barrel for around 30 months, and then it's in bottle for at least 8 or 9 months before I release it. So this 16 just got released. This is the current release on this.
Yeah, no, it's really exciting. It's one of those grapes that I have met before. I'm actually friends with the representative for Wines of Uruguay in London. So yeah, she's Gabriela. She's often bringing Tanat to the party, as it were, and if we're tasting, then she'll often turn up with several bottles from Uruguay, and so I know all of the things that you referred to there about you just tread carefully, and I just think it's very drinkable. I think maybe that's a point that you have to make more with Tanat than maybe with some other varietals. That you don't necessarily need that steak and those sort of meats that they love down in Uruguay and in Argentina, and that work so well with the Malbec and with the Tanat. But maybe you don't always want that. Maybe you want to have a bit more flexibility. This has got the fruit forwards. This has got that, still maybe not quite as wild an edge as the Momtazi, but still something kind of almost brambly there, but just sort of something still with a lot of approachability, I would say, a lot of drinkability, which is in the end, that's what it all comes back to. They're made to be drunk, folks. So seek these wines out, because I think and again, you've done such a great job there of taking us kind of on that journey with you, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure. I feel like I've learned so much, and I feel like we've been able to share that with the listeners. We don't have a lot of time for the last question. I would just really, bearing in mind where we are and time of year, we're here in January 2020, and I'm just curious to know sort of, what sort of front of mind, what's something, maybe one thing that you kind of, either most optimistic about or you're potentially most looking forward to as we look ahead through into 2020.
In general, or in regard to wine? In general?
I mean, as you wish.
Well,
as you wish,
we have some, I will tell you what I'm looking most forward to. And this is completely political in nature, and that's how it is. We are dealing with a very odd political climate in our country right now. There are some tariffs that are on the table that have been proposed by our president that affect our relationship with wineries in the European Union. And we as a wine community in this country have all been very against them because we recognize how detrimental they would be to the wine industry in our country. And we've been doing everything we can to fight these tariffs. So they're going to come or they're not going to come. I don't know what's going to happen. But I do know that we have an election coming up this year. And the thing I am looking forward to the most is writing on my ballot that I am voting for somebody other than that fuckhead that we have in the White House. So sorry for the bad language, but that's how it is. That's the thing I'm looking forward to the most this year, is hopefully getting rid of him. And that will affects the wine business. It affects my life personally. And I would think that hopefully more than half of America feels the same way as me.
Thank you so much, Brianne. In many ways, the way that you were talking there about all the other growers in the region really shows the collaboration and the commitment to winemaking in the region. Do see below for the Day Wines website, which has details of all the wines that we tasted. And once again, if you are in the UK, Brianne is not currently exporting wines to here and is actively seeking representation. And as you heard, Brianne already made the connection to next time, episode 390, where I sit down with Kate Norris, co-owner and winemaker at Division Winemaking Company. If you're not already subscribed to the podcast, please do head over to interpretingwine.com/listen, where you can choose where to follow on your favorite podcast station. And as ever, I would love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.